I wanted to start with a little bit of a personal story. I was thinking about how longer ago than I now like to admit, when I was a kid growing up in Peace River in northern Alberta, my dad had a special technique for waking my mother's youngest brother who worked on the farm and really did not like to get up in the morning. And what he would do is he would stand outside his bedroom and he would shout, "Bogdane, Bogdane, you have to get up. There's a revolution in the Central Asian republics. It has spread to Moscow. It's spread to the streets of Kiev. Wake up, wake up." And Bogdan, who had gone to Ukrainian school and grown up in the sort of, passionate Ukrainian Canadian prairie community, would leap out of bed, turn on the radio, and, try to get news of this rebellion. What was particularly hilarious for my dad about this, apart from the fact that it got my uncle out of bed, he was, 16 or 17 at the time, was it seemed really ridiculous to him, right? The idea that there would actually be a revolution in the Soviet Union was just the kind of crazy thing that his crazy old Ukrainian in-laws kind of thought would happen. And, that kind of seemed right to me. And, then as you've heard, I went to Harvard, and one of the things I studied was Soviet studies. And sure enough, my extremely smart, extremely eminent professors, they also thought the Soviet Union would never fall apart, and this kind of deep-seated emotional view of our community that it would seemed kind of crazy. Then I found myself as a stringer in Ukraine in August 1991. And I was at the Ukrainian parliament when the first president, George Bush, addressed the Ukrainian parliamentarians, and he said, "You know what, guys? The Soviet Union really is not going to fall apart, and you shouldn't try to make it fall apart. It's not a good idea." Within 3 weeks, it had fallen apart, and that same group of parliamentarians had declared independence. For me, that was a very humbling moment, exhilarating in some ways, but humbling because it turned out that my grandparents, towards whom I had the attitude that I think, that first native-born immigrant generation often has towards the older people in the community, which was, loving, but a little bit superior, right? They didn't speak English that well. I went to Harvard, I was a Rhodes Scholar, I sort of knew how the world worked, and so did my professors, but they turned out to be right. And the expert class, into which I was trying to join, we turned out to be wrong. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, for obvious reasons. I think the events in North Africa have been another moment when we have seen the expert class turn out to be unprepared and to be wrong. And, just to give you a few examples, the IMF, they should know what they're talking about. In April of last year, they issued a report on Egypt, which praised the country's, quote, sustained and wide-ranging reforms since 2004. And they noted that thanks to those excellent economic reforms, the country was now more durable and less vulnerable to external shocks. You'll remember Leon Panetta, the CIA director who actually had that horrible experience of speaking to Congress and saying, for sure Mubarak is going to go today. And he didn't. Moving on to Libya, a couple of years ago, I had this sort of slightly surreal experience of within 72 hours dining twice with Saif Gaddafi. Because he was doing a tour of, the fancy dining rooms of New York. One was overlooking Central Park West. The other one was in 740 Park, which is considered to be the fanciest building in New York. And he was basically being courted by the rich, I won't name the people because that would be rude and indiscreet, but by, the rich hedge fund barons who wanted that $70 billion Libyan sovereign wealth fund to be invested in their funds. That was just 2 years ago. And these guys thought that he was the kind of person you could do business with. Likewise, the LSE's Howard Davies. So he wasn't the only one wrong-footed by the events there. And closer to my own profession, the 2008 financial crisis certainly wrong-footed so many of the experts, both people like business journalists who should have been a little more skeptical and seen it coming, but also the investors themselves. So why these reflections? Because I've been thinking about how hard it is for us as human beings, and particularly expert human beings, to adjust to big paradigm shifts, to see them coming, and then even after they have come, to change our behaviors. The paradigm I want to talk about today is foreign policy, and the way in which I think that foreign policy needs to reorient itself to adjust to what I think is the new challenge. And that new challenge is to put the economy at the heart of our foreign policy thinking. I'm not the first person to make this argument. Some of America's savviest wise men are already making it. If you saw in the December issue of Foreign Affairs, there were a couple of essays making the case that economics had to be more central to foreign policy thinking. But I think they didn't go far enough. Their arguments there were essentially, there was a piece by Leslie Gelb and by Richard Haas and Roger Altman, and their arguments essentially were, the Altman and Haas piece was, look, because America has a big budget deficit, it can't be as effective in foreign policy. The Leslie Gelb argument was, the main job of our foreign policy has to be to grow our GDP. I wouldn't disagree with those, but I think I would go further and say that the reason that we have to put economic issues and an economic way of thinking about the world at the center of our foreign policy paradigm isn't just because America is running out of money, but also because national security and international relations, the classic concerns of diplomacy of people here, are now largely driven by economic concerns. For much of the last century, it was the Cold War that was the defining framework of international relations. Containing communism and ultimately helping to defeat it were, I think rightly, I've admitted that I'm Ukrainian, the defining goals of the West's engagement with the rest of the world. In the triumphal aftermath of the end of the Cold War, the tempting and obvious next step for many Western countries was to shape foreign policy around an agenda of bringing democracy or free markets or some combination of both to the rest of the world. And I spoke with some diplomats here earlier who were in Russia while I was there. We saw that, that was the agenda, that was the campaign. Then you had 9/11, and for many, especially George Bush and Tony Blair, although knowing where I am, I have to point out, Jean Chrétien didn't fall for it. But for many, the reaction to 9/11 was to add teeth and a more traditional national security justification to that campaign. And, instead, really in an echo of the Cold War, you had a new black and white. It was us versus the Islamic extremists. And actually, Daniel Pipes, the son of one of my Harvard professors, Richard Pipes, who was one of the great people who formulated the Cold War foreign policy approach, Daniel Pipes wrote some really influential and I thought smart pieces about how we needed to shift that paradigm to be versus the Islamic threat. Nearly a decade later, though, I think the threat posed by what, at an extreme you had people calling Islamofascism seems a lot less all-encompassing. And the responses, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, imperfect, even in the view of many of their supporters. Meanwhile, my argument tonight is that a new defining international issue for America and for everybody else is this: how do we organize the world economy? This has been a rising concern since the collapse of communism and the subsequent adoption of some version of capitalism by almost all of the Western world. But for me, it was the meltdown of 2008, which moved the challenges of the global economy from being a concern of Wall Street or of Bay Street or of the City of London to a concern of the foreign ministries around the world. The financial crisis showed us that globalization is not only an engine for international economic growth, but a source of grave and really global risks. Healing the global economy, I think, is now the world's most urgent priority, and it's not a job that can be done on the national level. Nuclear weapons were the dominant concern of the Cold War. Fighting actual wars was the dominant concern of the post-9/11 era. Today, the most important mission of foreign ministers and heads of states is figuring out how to rebalance the world economy and fight the protectionist impulses, which are inevitable reaction to the recession. Here's why I think that's so vital and also so difficult. The revolutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union that I reported on 20 years ago didn't just oust particular economic regimes. They were the defeat of an idea about how economies should be organized. Nowadays, we are all capitalists and global traders of one sort or another. And that's not just true of the former Warsaw Pact. It's true also of China, which crushed its own revolution in 1989, but also of India, which never adopted the political restrictions of orthodox communism, but was once pretty gung-ho about central planning. If you talk to Indian economists nowadays of a certain generation, it's really fun because they'll tell you about beginning their careers in the Ministry of Central Planning and getting training from the Russians on how to do a nationwide central plan. You know, they really believe that, and that's been a really big shift. The thing is, though, that global capitalism is a very broad church. I think that's great if you believe in heterogeneity and pluralism and experimentation, which I do. But as more and more of everyone's economy goes global, not having an agreed set of rules, let alone designated umpires, makes it hard to keep the game going. I was on a panel in Washington maybe a couple of months ago now, with a guy called Ron Bloom, who has had an interesting career. First, he was a Wall Street lawyer, then he worked for the Detroit unions, and now he's an assistant to Barack Obama for manufacturing policy. And he was talking very passionately about China. And his big point was that the Chinese were playing the world economic game with one set of rules, and the Americans were playing with another set of rules. He was careful to say, I'm not saying our rules are better than their rules. And interestingly, nowadays, you hear lots of Americans suggesting that maybe other people are as good or better at running their economies as the Americans are. But he did say that having these two different sets of rules operating at the same time was, he thought, the biggest challenge that the White House faces. Of course, figuring out a framework for the world economy isn't a novel challenge. That's what the Bretton Woods agreements were about. That's what the Plaza Accords more recently were about. The European Union started as an economic pact, and with the European coal and steel community. And organizing economic relations between the European states remains, I think, the central job of the EU. But what I think is new is that virtually every country in the world today is in some way capitalist. And ironically, that makes it harder to figure out what the system under which we should all operate is. Not only are there more and more varied players at the table, but in contrast with Bretton Woods, the ability of a single superpower to dictate the rules for everybody else is much diminished. The stakes are high. The 2008 financial crisis is the most recent example of what can happen when the global economy gets out of balance and the rules of international finance don't work. For some of the countries in the industrialized West on the wrong side of those capital flows, the domestic consequences were more devastating than any world event since the Second World War. Think about Iceland, think about Ireland, think about Greece. The upside, I think, is really important also. Devising an effective international economic order and achieving our country's best possible place in it is surely the best route to national prosperity. And I think it's a powerful way to satisfy the more traditional demands of a national security agenda. If the global economy is working, surely we will have less reason to go to war with each other. Clearly, developing a foreign policy paradigm focused on the global economy is a huge project, and it is far beyond the scope of my remarks tonight. But what I think I can do is sketch out a few things. So I'm going to talk about the three big areas that I think an economic way of thinking about foreign policy needs to consider. Then I'm going to talk about two powerful cross currents, two things that I think are going to make this project more difficult. And then will be the modest part of my talk where I talk about what it can't do and what the other big issues are left on the table. That's trying to diffuse your criticisms in advance. So starting with what I think are the three big issues, and just to flag them, they're going to be the movement of money, the movement of goods, and the movement of people. Starting with the movement of money. So global capital flows. That used to be the province of either geeky accountants or plutocratic hedge fund chiefs. They didn't really matter for foreign policy unless you were a really poor country that could be totally knocked off course by the inflow of hot inflow or outflow of hot foreign money. But in this respect, 2008 was a great equalizer because rich countries discovered that global contagion of global financial crises wasn't just for the emerging markets. It was for rich Western countries too. Look again at Ireland or Iceland. Even here, in the land of virtuous bankers and omniscient regulators, I think maybe those guys are our new Mounties, the global crisis packed a powerful and unpleasant punch. To talk about managing the movement of money in a global and digital economy clearly is a huge issue. And I'm going to just talk about some areas we need to think about and divide it into two categories. One is the government's money, and the second is private money. So, starting with the government's money. If you're unconvinced by my argument that geoeconomics needs to become a central concern on foreign policy, think about the political and diplomatic consequences of what states do with their own money, and maybe you'll be persuaded. Consider two of the most contentious issues in international relations over the past year, at least prior to the Jasmine Revolution, were China's exchange rate and the US central bank's policy of quantitative easing. These days, the Chinese exchange rate in the US, where I live, is actually a hot subject for political discussion. And I'm speaking here among Canadians, so I'll admit that we may be somewhat disdainful of the level of political discourse on American TV in Middle America, all that sort of stuff. I share that disdain somewhat myself. One of the things that was striking for me about the midterms was the extent to which really specific issues in Chinese economic policy were a subject of some of those congressional races. Now, I'm not saying that the dialogue around them was particularly sophisticated, but the number of ads around China and around actually Chinese monetary policy was really tremendous. People are really thinking about it in the American heartland. As far as the Federal Reserve and monetary policy there becoming a subject for international debate, just think about Ben Bernanke, quantitative easing, QE2 as we in the trade call it, and recall that Guido Montanha, the Brazilian foreign minister, accused Ben Bernanke, a mild professorial sort of guy, of firing the first shot in the global currency wars because of a US monetary policy decision. That's a really interesting shift of these sorts of issues from the world of economists and central bankers into the foreign policy debate. There are other ways that governments' control of their money becomes a foreign policy issue. If you're a rich country, and particularly a commodity-rich country or a powerful exporter, your central bank has lots of reserves, and maybe you have a big sovereign wealth fund, as Saif Gaddafi, for example, controlled. And the movement of that money becomes, weapon is maybe too heated a term, but certainly a tool for foreign policy for many of these countries that have big sovereign wealth funds, big currency reserves. Of course, governments don't control just their own money. There's also private money, and that's money that governments tax and regulate. Financial regulation is the main way that governments control the flow of private money. But more and more, I think the discourse is becoming more and more open to overt government control of private money. And I'll cite for you the example of capital controls. Again, I think during that period of the Washington Consensus, there was a sense that capital controls were something that bad, unenlightened countries did. And as they sort of rose to a higher level of American capitalism, they wouldn't do it. But actually, they're coming back into vogue. On Monday, I interviewed John Lipsky, the deputy head of the IMF. He's a former vice chairman of JP Morgan, very sort of serious mainstream economist guy. And he said to me, there could be cases in which temporary capital controls might be necessary and useful. He said it through sort of, bared teeth. He wasn't thrilled about it, but it's the new orthodoxy at the IMF. He had to say it. And, the Brazilians are doing it, and they have the blessing of Dominic Strauss-Kahn. The 2008 financial crisis is, of course, the obvious illustration of the ways in which government's control or lack of control over private money can have a global effect. And I think that national decisions about the flow of money within their economy can have an international effect in more subtle ways too. My favorite example is what I think was one of the really important and maybe insufficiently remarked upon drivers of the 2008 crisis, which was this regulatory race to the bottom. I remember it because, to my shame, I wrote some of those stories and certainly I edited them. But there was really a prevailing view in the first decade of this century that there was a real competition between London and New York over who's going to be the global financial center. And the prevailing view, and this was, sort of blessed by McKinsey, blessed by stories in the Financial Times, was the way you win this race to be the global financial center is to be the best at what was called light touch regulation. Well, we all know how that ended. And it had consequences beyond the borders of the countries that did it. As an aside, I think it would be funny if it weren't so painful to note that nowadays when people talk about what is the rising financial center, what is going to be the dominant one in 20, 30, or 40 years, a city I hear often mentioned is Shanghai, which has many virtues, but those don't include being controlled by a government disinclined to meddle in the economy. We're seeing, 2008 is not that far away, but I am already hearing a similar sort of discussion developing around questions of regulations of hedge funds, the impact of the Volcker rule, the impact of taxation of hedge funds in areas like carried interest. And already a lot you hear the argument being made, well, you, country X, can't do this because if you do, you will lose this business to another country. So that, to me, is a way in which the national debates really can have an impact on other countries and also, again, as we saw in 2008, have a real impact on the global system. Second subject I wanted to talk about, the movement of goods. This is a much more familiar foreign policy concern, and it's one that generations of economists have explored, that has been regulated by extensive national laws, treaties. We have global institutions like the WTO to manage it. I'd like to just mention three important new twists that I think we're seeing because of globalization. The first is the power, I'll tell you what the three are first. They are the power of export-led growth, the importance of ideas in international trade, and the voracious appetite for commodities as more poor people become middle class. I'd like to start with export-led growth because I think this is a really big issue and one which we think about too much in a national framework and forget the international implications. So when I talk about the challenge of export-led growth, I like to use a smart phrase that my friend and former professor Larry Summers came up with, and that is his point that there are no Martians. Here's what he means. We've seen that export-led growth is a fantastic strategy for individual countries. It's worked really well for the Chinese, and they are just the latest Asian country to rise out of poverty through an export-led growth strategy. But it works for Western industrialized countries too. I mean, look at Germany, which I would say is one of the most successful Western economies right now, pursuing aggressively an export-led growth strategy. You hear now a lot of China and German envy in the United States, mostly around this issue. Why can't we have an export-led growth strategy too? But I think the problem with that is obvious, and this is why Larry says there are no Martians. If every country decides, I want to be the super exporter with a trade surplus and have export-led growth be what powers my economy, who is going to buy the trade surplus goods of planet Earth? A really, really big problem. We didn't worry about that before because for the first part of this millennium, the Martians in the world economy were Americans, the American consumer. No matter how much other economies could produce, there was always that voracious American consumer there to buy it up. But that ended with the 2008 financial crisis. And now not only has the American consumer's access to credit become more constrained, but he may have lost his job or fear that he might. this has left Americans really, really frightened. I was on an ABC talk show last weekend, Christiane Amanpour's show, and the segment they had us discuss was actually a really clever one done by one of their reporters, where he went to the home of an American family, and he said, I want to do an experiment with you guys. I want to take everything out of your house that wasn't made in America. And so sort of hilariously, they went through the whole house, and was this made in America, was that made in America? The classic thing of, American flag produced in Taiwan, that sort of stuff. Anyway, they did the experiment. The only things left in the house after this were literally the kitchen sink and a vase with flowers. It was otherwise empty. This is really, really scaring the Americans. And the conclusion of this program was export-led go, buy American, export-led growth. At the level of actual policy of what I want to call geoeconomics, the no Martians problem hasn't, at least not yet, translated into a significant protectionist drive. And surprisingly, for free traders like me, especially given the experience of the Great Depression, where you did have a protectionist response, that hasn't happened yet. But it has led to significant and overt pressure on the most powerful practitioner of export-led growth, China, to stimulate domestic demand. I think that this is really a remarkable moment, that we now think that it is reasonable for countries in their relations with others to have a strong point of view on what your national economic policy should be. This is now taken for granted, particularly in the United States, that it is absolutely reasonable to demand of the Chinese government that it reorient its economy and have regular Chinese people buy more GE refrigerators. But that's a really big deal and a really big shift of where foreign policy is allowed to reach. The second twist I want to talk about in the movement of goods is the importance of ideas and goods based on ideas in global commerce. Trade in these products, everything from my BlackBerry, which I left over there, to word processing software, to Google Ads, is an intensely political business. It depends on robust intellectual property laws, which can pit domestic bootleggers against foreign sellers. And really importantly, as we're seeing right now, many of these products have the power to undermine authoritarian regimes. That makes those regimes really scared about them. What does foreign policy have to say about that? An important question for geoeconomics is the extent to which we should be trying to devise international rules and indeed rights governing the trade in ideas. And to what extent should diplomats be backing their country's own businesses when disputes about this arise? Of course, these ideas-based products aren't unique in being both the subject of international trade and of national security. We've had high-tech manufactured goods like jet engines around for a long time that raise similar concerns. But what I think makes this trade in ideas-based goods more complicated now is what an HP executive described to me as the consumerization of technology. A Boeing or a Bombardier contract is important to that company's workers, to its shareholders, to its executives. But there is a much wider public interest in what happens with Google, what happens with BlackBerry. The final geoeconomic issue in the movement of goods that I want to talk about is the rising value and strategic power of commodities. A lot of us, especially in a place like Ottawa, not so much in Peace River, like to think of this as being the era of virtual goods and of the creative class. But actually, we're also living in the age of commodities. That's because, as we all know, hundreds of millions of people who were really, really poor now can afford to eat meat. They can afford to wear more than one set of clothes, cotton, rising in value. They can afford maybe to buy some sort of motor vehicle or buy some appliance. Since the Industrial Revolution, technological innovation has consistently defied the grim prediction of Malthusians and neo-Malthusians. So I don't want to suggest here that there's a danger that the world is going to run out of stuff. I very much don't believe in that. But I do think that in the short term, natural resources, including agricultural land, my dad asked me to put that in, are appreciating not only in economic value, but they are becoming strategic tools. So far, the Russians and the Chinese have been the most aggressive about connecting the dots between commodities and foreign policies. For Western Europe, and even for Ukrainians, Gazprom often seems a more threatening arm of the Russian state than its military does. And last September, we saw China using rare earths explicitly as a weapon in a territorial dispute with Japan. With oil now at more than $100 a barrel and food price shocks having a real catalytic effect in North Africa, I think that this is going to be a really important issue for foreign policy to think about, not just those commodity traders. The final piece of geoeconomics that I wanted to sort of flag for your attention, something for you guys to write position papers on and elaborate an excellent Canadian foreign policy about, please, is the movement of people. I'm especially happy to be talking about that here because one of the reasons I am a proud Canadian is Canada's immigration policy. I think it's really terrific and a huge contrast to the United States. But one thing I did want to think about as we think about the movement of people and how that can have an impact not just on our national economies, but on our foreign policy, on how our country relates to the rest of the world, is the way the immigrant experience has changed in an age of globalization, cheap transport, and easy mass communications. I think about my grandparents. When they finally made it from Ukraine to Canada, a terribly difficult journey through DP camps in Germany and so forth, they never went back. That was partly because the Soviet Union was an authoritarian regime and they probably would have been arrested and shot or sent to Siberia, so not a great idea. But it was also because travel was really expensive and communication was really difficult. I contrast that with my friends Andriy and Natalka, whose children go to Ukrainian school with my own in New York. Andriy, whose brother lives in Toronto, sends his sons every summer back home to his village outside Chernivtsi for the summer. He says it's because he doesn't want them to become too snobby. He is an investment banker who works at Barclays, and his sons go to one of the fanciest, toniest prep schools in New York, and he is worried they will become lazy, bad at math, and take life for granted. So they spend 2 months a year in a village in Ukraine that has no electricity or running water. It does toughen the kids up. He also sends money home, and his mother spends about a month a year in New York and in Toronto. It's not just immigrants like Andriy who have the money who can maintain that very close set of connections with their home country. I have another Ukrainian friend in New York, Nadia. She's a cleaner and a babysitter. She's going to go to teacher college in September. She sends money back home every month. She goes home at least once a year. And she is in very close contact with her friends through the Russian version of Facebook called Odnoklasniki. Every immigrant community nowadays is tied with this sort of very, very intense web of connections. I was in Vancouver about 6 months ago, and people were talking to me about the so-called satellite dads, whose business was principally based in China and whose families lived in Vancouver and who went back and forth. I interviewed recently the CEO of Zappos, the online shoe guys. If you don't, strongly suggest excellent way to buy your shoes. And the guy who runs it, young kid, I think, he's the son of Taiwanese immigrants. When Zappos decided that they wanted to make their own label shoes, he called up his father, who is Taiwanese, Chinese, and his dad is the guy who went to China, got in touch with his old friends. They now run Zappos factories. So again, that close web of connections. And of course, I guess I am an immigrant. I live in New York, but I maintain close connections with my home country. Here I am. I even write a weekly column for the best newspaper in my home country. So immigration is no longer a one-way trip. And that's important for a geoeconomic approach to foreign policy to understand, because it's an opportunity, but it's also a threat. Again, given where I am, I don't think I need to lean too heavily on the way that it's an opportunity and the way that having immigrants in your country who are rooted really in your own country but have great ties in some of these fast-growing emerging markets surely has to be an economic advantage. I need to wrap up, so 5 minutes. I'll start talking really fast. Thank you, Hector. But governments are scared of it too. So think about Egypt. Will Gnoming, the Google executive who played such an important role in the Egyptian revolution, he lives in Dubai. And his boss, who actually is a friend of mine, is an Irish woman who lives in Mountain View, California. Mohammed el-Baradei, another important figure in the Egyptian revolution, spends most of his time in Vienna. An economically focused approach to foreign affairs means that we have to understand that immigration policy isn't just a domestic issue, but it's an important part of how our country is connected to the rest of the world. Countries, I think, that get this right will be plugged into the rest of the world at an organic level that hundreds of trade delegations could never achieve. But in exchange, we're going to need to embrace an expansive notion of citizenship and national belonging that some will find culturally threatening. I'm going to try not to mention Peter King and his investigation into the American Muslim communities too much, although I think it's shocking and horrible. That was my editorializing. So those are the three big areas I think we have to think about. I'm now quickly going to mention the two important and complicating cross currents. The first, and I think that this is a really huge issue in and of itself, is that business is global, even as politics remains national. Remember Charlie Wilson and his much maligned comment about what was good for GM was good for America. It just isn't true anymore, and I am not speaking out of some sort of, malign vision of the goal of the big multinationals in the world, but they operate in a truly global universe. So think about companies like RIM or my own Thomson Reuters. They're proudly Canadian, but their fortunes don't depend very much at all on how Canada does. It's even happening for the big American companies, and this is really shocking for them because America is a really big place, and for a really long time, you could be extremely successful in business and really only care about the United States. It's not true anymore. And I'm going to read you a quote from Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE, that for me illustrated the shift and also how surprising it was for him. Less surprising, I think, for those of us who come from a smaller place. So here's what Immelt said to me when I interviewed him a couple weeks ago. I came to GE in 1982. For the first 20 years, the American consumer was the definitive driver of the global economy. Now, part of that was false, right? Part of it was credit that they shouldn't have had and houses that probably shouldn't have been built. But that was the fact. So now, well, the American consumer will always be important, but for the next 25 years, it's probably not going to be the engine of global growth. It's going to be the billion people joining the middle class in Asia. It's going to be what resource-rich countries do with their newfound wealth. That's the game. So Immelt, advisor to President Obama, as American as you can possibly be, and his horizon is very much not America anymore. And it's not just business which is global, it's the businessmen, it's the business leaders. And again, I'm just going to quickly read you one quote because I like it so much, from a guy called Glenn Hutchins. He's the co-founder of Silver Lake, which is a private equity group. And he was talking to me about the way in which the business elites now have more in common with each other than they do with their neighbors. So here's what he said. A person who runs a big African bank and went to Harvard might have more in common with me than he does with his neighbors. And I could well share more overlapping concerns and experiences with him than I do with my own neighbors. Beijing has a lot in common with New York, London, or Mumbai. You see the same people, you eat in the same restaurants, you stay in the same hotels. What I find so amazing about that is actually, I don't think Beijing has that much in common with New York or London. But for someone like Glenn Hutchins, the life is almost identical. They all stay in exactly the same hotels. Four Seasons, usually another great Canadian success story. So they stay in the Four Seasons wherever they are. They sort of even have the same shampoo and toothpaste. They don't really notice. And then they go to the hotel restaurant, and it's the same person that they would see in New York. I had breakfast at the Four Seasons the other day with Dominic Barton, Canadian guy, runs McKinsey. And he was seeing Steve Schwartzman, who runs Blackstone, that afternoon, and he said, I haven't seen Steve since I ran into him in Shanghai 2 months ago. So that's what they do. And that is a complicating factor when you're trying, when you're sitting in Ottawa trying to formulate foreign policy, if your business class is operating really at this transnational level. The second cross current that I want to mention, I've alluded to already, and that is that in this world of the globalized economy, deciding what is strictly the national interest, what we can interfere with in the affairs of our neighbors, and what we can't becomes harder and harder. And I've already given an example of that Chinese domestic demand we now consider a legitimate subject of international discourse. Final conclusion. I know I've run out of time, Hector, but it's just 2 minutes. So I've addressed or raised a really big question tonight and suggested that foreign policy needs to, make, I wouldn't call it a 180-degree shift, but maybe 60 degrees towards really putting economic concerns in the center. I don't want you to think I'm crazy. So defensively, I want to point out there are, of course, very important foreign policy issues that are not in the economic realm. They still exist. Let me mention a few of them. The environment, of course. There are, of course, still classic and very dangerous military threats, and these are still really nuclear, North Korea, Iran. And I want to specify human rights because I think too often the think about the economy and foreign policy camp tends to dismiss human rights concerns, and I think that can be a real mistake, even actually undermining your effort to have an economically driven foreign policy, as we are seeing with what is now very visibly the mistaken backing of dictators who we thought guaranteed economic stability. Those dictators may not be as economically beneficial for other countries as you had thought. Having said all of that, I want to also say that, and my concluding story, an economic way of thinking about foreign policy might actually not be as foreign as you think. And so I want to conclude by saying what I think is, and I hope the foreign policy mandarins here will forgive me for this, the biggest triumph of Canadian foreign policy in the past decade. And that, in my view, is conservative banking regulation. So you probably don't think of that as foreign policy. It's the province of the Ministry of Finance and OSFI and the Bank of Canada. And it didn't really have much to do with Canada's role in the global economy. It was about leverage limits and capital requirements for this country's own banks. But I think it was actually foreign policy of the most important sort. It was a big and contrarian decision about what Canada would do in the global economy. I think it took some courage. And at the time, we journalists mocked the people who took those decisions. I think Eric Regeley will never live down his story about how RBC should have been more like RBS, Royal Bank of Canada should be more like Royal Bank of Scotland. Because remember, those guys, they seemed so great. They were global behemoths, and these Bay Street guys were so boring and so Canadian. But of course, that turned out to be really a brilliant decision. And if you think about the job of foreign policy being protecting your country from external threats, then that decision to not have a Canadian seat at the casino of international finance was probably the smartest and most important foreign policy decision of recent years. Thank you very much.